All right, moving on. Oh, look, it's a question from Zachariah Tiemans. Do you prefer the aerial-based aesthetic of Star Wars ships, which really is Star Wars fighters and things, or the naval-based aesthetic of Star Trek ships? Which is more compelling and which is more realistic? Well, obviously, the Star Trek version of ships is more realistic than fighter planes, but that doesn't mean it's realistic. So let's walk through these two. We'll walk through the Star Wars model, we'll walk through the Star Trek model, and then we'll walk into reality. Star Wars is not science fiction. I like Star Wars okay. I mean, I had a good time at Star Wars, but Star Wars didn't get into my DNA the way that Star Trek did. And that's a generational thing, I guess. So when I watch the first Star Wars and I see the X-Wing fighters rolling in and they're banking in space and they're pulling out of dives and doing all this other stuff, I understand what it is. It's fantasy. It's cartoon. He built that sequence on, fighter attacks on American bombers. He literally looked at all this gun camera footage from World War II, saw these fighters peeling off, said, that's kind of cool, poo-poo, choo-choo-choo, poo-poo-poo, and then, pull out, bail out, look up, boom, crash, down it goes, plane gets hit, X-Wing fighter gets hit, and its engine explodes, and then it just descends into the Death Star, which has a gravity field of essentially zero. It's utter fantasy. It's utter, complete fantasy, period. I'm a pilot. I like flying airplanes and I like fighter pilots. I just think it's silly, personally. It's fun to play, but it's silly. Wing Commander's fun, but it's silly. Now, when you get into Star Trek and you start thinking of ships, big space vehicles as ships, you're somewhat better, but you're damn near actually, believe it or not, Zechariah, you're almost as bad, for a number of reasons. Now, with the Enterprise, you've got a couple things that make the Enterprise look like a naval vessel, and these are magical workarounds because you want it to look like a naval vessel. You want it to look like a ship, and it turns. It doesn't. When the Enterprise turns, it might list a little bit and kind of lean into the turn, but it doesn't bank into the turn. It doesn't do a 90-degree turn, and everything's on the same plane, by the way, right? The vehicles are all on the same plane. It's like the solar system is flat, and here's the Enterprise, and the top of the Enterprise is up, and here comes the Klingon ship, and the top of it is up, and they're both on a level C in space, and so that's why it feels like a naval battle. As I said on my Star Trek Afterburner, which is a favorite thing I ever did. It's not my best work, but it's my favorite work. Roddenberry was influenced. He said he wanted to make a Western in space. He said he wanted to make wagon train in space, but what he really was making was Horatio Hornblower movies. He loved Horatio Hornblower, and he loved the idea that the captain Captain Horatio Hornblower, as a young man commanding a ship of the Royal Navy on the other side of the world, was not just the Royal Navy. He was England. He had to make decisions for the Empire. He didn't get to get on the subspace radio or call Chief of Naval Operations and say, I've run into a French frigate, what do I do? The thing that fascinated Roddenberry about Hornblower was that Captain Horatio Hornblower was England, and he was empowered by the Royal Navy and the Queen to represent England, and if he was going to start a war, it would be on his shoulders. That's fascinating to me and to Roddenberry, and that's what he wanted Kirk to be. He wanted Kirk to be America. He wanted Federation to be America. He wanted Kirk to be an American who had to make decisions based on his value set, and he didn't get to ask permission. That's what Star Trek was. But anyway, in order to get that naval feel, where up is up, and the ships are on the same flat plane, and nobody's, Klingons are coming one way, the Enterprise is coming the other way. Nobody's coming down, and nobody's coming down at an angle. In Wrath of Khan, they barely scratch the surface of three-dimensional things. His tactics represent a certain limited three-dimensional thinking or lack of three-dimensional thinking, so they move in the Z-coordinate for the first time in the history of spaceflight. The big tactical win in Wrath of Khan, which I loved. It's one of my favorite movies ever, don't get me wrong. It's one of my favorite. It may have been the best movie experience I ever had, watching Wrath of Khan in a theater. But, at the end of this, it's like, what are we going to do to defeat this mad genius, Khan? We could move in 3 dimensions in space. That might fool him. Yeah, let's try that. So you've got Star Trek, which feels more realistic than Star Wars, but Star Trek is not realistic at all. First of all, we have to understand that much as it's painful to admit it, Star Wars is utter fantasy. Star Trek is science fiction because they go to the trouble to explain how this could work. But just because they're explaining how something could work doesn't mean that's how it will work. What he wanted was something that looked like a naval vessel. So what does that mean? It means that you've got a warp drive, which means there is no reaction mass. A thing can accelerate and slow down. It doesn't have to turn around to slow down. Every rocket in the world, if you want to slow down, you just have to turn it around and point the rocket in the other direction. The Enterprise never does that. It just slows down. Like a ship, like there's drag. And you have to have artificial gravity. So you've got these horizontal decks. And this is the key thing about why Star Trek is not terribly realistic compared to what we know about spaceflight. This is the simplest thing, but it's also one of the most important things. Think about the Enterprise in cross-section. Hold that thought. Don't go away. Somebody do a tap dance. Let's not even get into why I have one of these things. Okay, so here's the Enterprise, right? I'll make it look, yeah. Okay, so here's the Enterprise. And here's what's key about why Star Trek is not realistic in terms of what we know to be the truth today. As I said, first of all, there's no rocket acceleration. The thing uses a drive. It's essentially a reactionless thing. So it goes forward and then it slows down. When the Enterprise is going this way, it doesn't turn around and go backwards, blasting its rocket engine to slow down. But the main thing that makes Star Trek unrealistic is this, compared to what the real world will be for the foreseeable future. Here's the Enterprise, and the Enterprise moves that way. The Enterprise goes through space like that, right? But gravity on the Enterprise is doing that. Gravity is going down. So there's a deck, and everybody's walking with their feet that way so that the gravity field is perpendicular to the direction of travel. Right? It's just that simple. Enterprise is moving sideways, but gravity is going down. Because that's what we have come to know. That's what's familiar to audiences who don't have a big background in spaceflight. There are certain things about actual spaceflight that are absolutely counterintuitive. But that doesn't mean that people won't understand them. It just means that no one's done the work to educate the audience in it. So, the main reason that Star Trek is still extremely unrealistic is for that reason. When you are accelerating under rocket power, the force is downward. So the way to think about a rocket is to think of it as a skyscraper. That's the way to think about what a rocket would look like. Think of the Empire State Building horizontal. Because whenever that rocket is firing, there is no gravity in space. You're not pulled in any one direction or another. So if you've got a rocket in space, here's my rocket. We used to do this when we were children. Here's a rocket in space, right? And here's the end where the stuff comes out. So the thing fires and it starts moving this way. Well, because it's moving this way and you're not doing anything, you're just hanging out in space weightless. As the rocket moves that way, it pushes you. You're standing on a bulkhead. It pushes you so that as this rocket burns, down isn't that way. Down is that way. That's down. So it's actually a skyscraper, top floor, all the way down to the bottom floor. Gravity is down, but since it's under acceleration, that's cool. But if it's under acceleration, that's the same thing. That's basically what I'm trying to say. What I'm basically trying to say is that rockets produce thrust, and when the rocket engine is firing, there is a pseudo-gravity that is as good as real gravity. It's as good as centrifugal gravity. And that gravity vector is pointing towards the engine. That's the best way to think of it. your feet are going to be pointing towards the engine and your head is going to be pointing away from the engine. And as long as that rocket is firing, you have a gravity field. And somebody just pointed out something, Bill Thompson. I don't know if he was talking about the model. I'm assuming he is. You know why you go to all this trouble to have artificial gravity and inertial dampers and all the other stuff? The reason is pretty simple. The reason is because this is gorgeous. This is just gorgeous. It is Enterprise A, is the best looking thing ever designed. I mean, if I could have anything in the entire wish list of the world, the Jupiter 2 would be nice to, dick around in. But this is the best looking thing of all time. It's just fabulous. It's incredible. Much better than the original series and infinitely better than that big-headed, weak-haunched, appalling Enterprise D on Next Generation. You can fight it out among yourselves. Anyway, when we talk about realism in motion in space, Zechariah, neither Star Wars, which is just plain absurd, or Star Trek, which is a naval translation into space, is realistic. It's going to look like something that no one's ever seen before. And what's going to blow people's minds, I think, in Aurora is something that's just so straightforward to actual rocket scientists, but you never, ever, 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 ever see it. When you are trying to slow down, you may be moving at a clip like that. You're going that way very fast, but the engine is facing forward. The ship is traveling backwards, and the engine is firing. In other words, the flame is coming out of the engine, but you're going that way. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but it obviously does make perfect sense. If you're moving forward at 1,000 meters per second and you start to slow down, you've got to push in the opposite direction. So when you get to these guys decelerating in order to get into a Jupiter insertion burn or something, or even a comet insertion burn, you're going to see the ship moving in one direction, but the engine is going to be at the front instead of at the back, and the engine is going to be firing, and it's going to say to everybody, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. It should be going the other way. Well, it's trying to go the other way. That's why it's doing it. It's slowing down. And I don't care if people don't get it. I think they are going to get it. We had this discussion before on the Stratosphere Lounge where we talked about Crimson Tide and how you don't have to have the truth there, and people may not miss it if it's not there, but if it is there, they'll know it. So that's basically the difference. Think of a ship more as a skyscraper. The decks will not be longitudinally arranged; they'll be vertically arranged. There's no reason not to, unless you have magical technology, in which case, fine, rock on. But even if you have magical technology, there's still no reason to do it. Why would you do it? Why would you go to all the trouble to make everything perpendicular to what you're going to be doing most of the time anyway? It's laziness is what it is. It's laziness. And that's why the real future is going to make our attempts to guess the future look as bad as watching Flash Gordon try to explain this whole thing. You can get to something that approximates the truth. You just got to be willing to drop your preconceptions of what you think would look cool and go with what's actually real. So these are things that are they have their own beauty. And I'll elaborate on this because I think we'll open up the next one. We're going to make this a two-parter. Maybe we'll talk more about space combat in the next one, because space combat, I can do 3 hours on that. But just as one more example, not in the first movie, but in the second movie, the sequel to Aurora, there is, in fact, a situation where we go to war with China in space. And I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about this, too. And this is hundreds of things to talk about there, but this is the simplest one. We are so used to seeing the Enterprise fire phasers and seeing the beams come out of this thing, even if we couldn't actually see it, because we're seeing them leave like they're high-speed things, But even forgetting the speed at which they travel, you cannot see a beam of energy in space. You can't see a beam of energy in a room. If you were in a dark room and the room was filtered so that there was nothing in it, if the air was absolutely pure, I could put the world's most powerful spotlight directly 2 inches in front of your nose, going perpendicular to your vision, and you would never know it was there. You'd have no way of knowing it was there. The reason that you can see beams like a flashlight beam on Earth at nighttime, or laser beams, in here on Earth is because you're not seeing the beam. You're not seeing the light beam. What you're seeing is dust particles being illuminated by the beam. So the beam is invisible. Light is invisible. You can't actually see light. Light, as I said, the most powerful beam of light can go right in front of your eyes, perpendicular to your eyes. You never know it was there. All you can see is when the energy from a light beam strikes matter, it reflects, and then you can see that. You can see the matter being reflected. So laser beams look cool on Earth because they're so narrow and so tight. But as a guy who ran laser shows in planetariums and nightclubs for 10 years, I can tell you virtually most all of the work I did that wasn't during the show was work cleaning and maintaining those damn smoke machines. Those things are horrible. They smell bad, the smoke juice is awful, and they clog easily, and they don't last very long. You really got to stay on top of them. A smoke machine is just a heater, basically. It's just a heating element that you pour a liquid onto, and when the liquid hits this heating element, it makes smoke. Why do we need so many smoke machines for a laser show? Because if you don't have a lot of smoke in that room, you won't see the beams. And the smokier the room is, the better the beams look. So now, in a nightclub, my job, in order to make the lasers really pop and make them look great, there's enough dust in any given room so that you could see beams at nighttime faintly in a room with no smoke in it. But my job was to put this mist, this smoke, into the room. And the more smoke I put into the room, the more particles I suspended in the air, the more that beam reflected those particles and the more those beams popped. They really just lit up. It was spectacular. It was great. Especially when you went straight to the krypton-argon blue-white beam and didn't peel off the individual colors. When you went to the undifferentiated beam, that thing was killer. You could almost hear it. That's another thing. So in space combat, in movie 2, the Chinese are going to have a laser weapon. And when this thing fires, you're not going to see anything. And that presents a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous problem for me as a writer and director and as a businessman. Because, and this is why, by the way, I've sat on these ideas for 30, 40 years, because I have to make them myself. Because if I don't make them myself, other people will screw them up. I promise you they will. They will not be able to resist it. If you showed people the Chinese firing this laser weapon and nothing visibly happens, there's not a studio in the world that would release that movie. They'd throw you out. They would throw you off the movie. They'd overrule you. So you have to own it. You have to own it, both ends of it, front end and back end. Now, with that said, this is the uber point in terms of science fiction for me personally. Yes, it's true. You fire a laser beam in space and you can't see the beam. That's not for speculation. It's not up for discussion. It's just true. You can't see a beam in space. So if you have a laser weapon in space, first of all, it may not even be in the visible spectrum. It may be a microwave or ultraviolet laser, but let's just say it's a visible beam, that the light is in something that the eye can see. You fire this thing off, you don't see any beam. And you sure as heck don't hear you don't hear or see anything. So, isn't that boring? Isn't that boring? Doesn't that just cheat the audience? It actually doesn't cheat the audience. It actually doesn't. It can be done in such a way as to completely engage the audience. You just have to not be lazy. So, if you fire a beam weapon in a movie and you want to make it dramatic, how do you do it if the beam's not visible? Well, turns out there's a bunch of cool things you can do. Remember I told you how what we would do in a laser show in a nightclub or in a planetarium, in order to make the beams visible, we would put smoke out there. And we put smoke out there because what happens with smoke is the beam hits the particles of smoke and those particles reflect it back. So that's why we can see the beam. But that does something else that's kind of interesting. It weakens the beam. In other words, a laser beam going from here to a spot a mile away will deliver a certain amount of energy in a clear atmosphere. The atmosphere itself is really slowing that beam down. It's much better in space. But if it's a very foggy night, that beam won't get there a mile away because the particles of fog are lighting up and it's spectacular to look at, but every time the energy of that beam hits a particle of fog and is deflected back to our eyes, it's pulling energy out of the beam. So what that means is that when you're having a space battle and you're fighting an enemy that has a laser weapon, an excellent way to defend against that laser weapon is to make space smoky, is to put something out there that's going to cause that beam to be diffused by it. In Traveler, the sci-fi role-playing game that meant so much to me, they were called sandcasters. And basically, in Traveler, all they were little canisters of sand. And you know that your enemy ship is out there, and you know they've got a laser weapon, and you know they're going to use their laser weapon against you. So you take this little canister of sand, like a depth charge, let's say, and you shoot it off in that direction. It goes a couple 100 yards out there, explodes. Now what you've got is you've got a tiny little cloud of sand and dust and dirt, and that beam has to punch through that. And as the beam comes through those particles, it shows up, it becomes visible, but it also weakens it. And sand might be good. Glitter would probably be even better because glitter is highly reflective, and glitter would diverse the beam even more. Chaff, anything, rice, marbles, flour, anything. If you put particles between you and the beam, those particles will pull the energy out of the beam. The beam will heat those particles up, and those particles will burn, and it'll take the energy out of the beam. And then, in the real world, what you have then is a visible laser beam at the destination, not at the launcher, but at the destination, because it's not a vacuum anymore. It may still be a vacuum, but it's not. Now there's something to reflect the beam, and we put it there on purpose. So isn't that much more interesting? If you have an initial attack, the first burst, let's say, and you think you're out of range, but they light it up on you, and all of a sudden the surface of your hull just starts to blister and glisten because this beam has hit you. You don't even know it. Jesus, what happened? Okay, so we thought we were out of range. My God, let's get some defenses out there. Blow some sand or whatever you want to call it, and then you send out a little canister out there, and it expands. You don't want it to blow up too much. You want to keep it kind of dense. And another beam comes through. Now all of a sudden there is a beam. There's this bright red beam or whatever, and instead of it just like coming in space, it's actually frying this stuff and vaporizing it. There's this incredible energy reaction, and then the part that hits the hull is attenuated. Great, fantastic. Now the problem is if you're moving, you're leaving your cloud behind you. So you got to keep popping these things. That gets to be really cool. And moving is another set of problems. But this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. We'll do a space war thing in part 2. We'll talk about weapons in space and space combat, because there's a lot of stuff in space combat that raises a lot of heckles, and I'm a real fanatic about part of this thing in terms of what it would actually look like. But you can see that by having a writer who understands the realities of the physics, what looks to be less interesting, we can't see these golden beams coming out of the phaser display, is actually much more interesting. And it's much scarier too, because you can be inside the ship and suddenly there's just a hole just appears. Just appears. I was going to say it would depressurize the ship, but if you're going to get in a spaceship fight, you want to depressurize your ship in advance anyway. It's interesting and it's different, and people understand it. And the other thing finally, I will save it for the space combat show because I don't want to get into that. We'll get into it later. But it's a great example of knowing the physics and knowing the reality and force-feeding it to an audience and making them get it, because they will. And then you've done something that is, in fact, the most important thing you can do in any kind of drama, period. And that is show people something new. That's interesting. That's not, because Star Wars was great and Star Wars is Star Wars, but how many times have they ripped that off? How many times have you seen it? How many times have you seen these, here comes a spaceship, it's the size of a city block, they're fighting, how far, what's the effective range of a phaser on the Enterprise? Is it 200 yards? You know? I mean, are they a quarter mile away when they open fire? No. When you open fire in space, you will not see the target. You won't be able to see it. You won't be able to, you might see a spot, but you won't be able to resolve it unless you get in really close. There's another thing here. Anyway, so much of that.